The hall was already full when she arrived, though she tried her best to stay unnoticed. People were talking, laughing softly, and moving around as they prepared for the small evening program. It was not a big concert or a grand event. It was something simple, arranged in a calm, formal setting where different performers would come and share their skills. Music, poetry, and short performances were expected throughout the evening. Nothing too serious, just a gathering meant for light entertainment. She stood near the side entrance for a moment, holding her small folder tightly in her hands. Inside the folder were a few sheets of music notes that she had practiced for days. Her fingers slightly trembled, not because she was unprepared, but because she knew the kind of people sitting inside. There were trained musicians, teachers, and people who had performed on real stages before. She, on the other hand, was known by almost no one in that room. She had been invited quietly, almost as an afterthought. Someone needed a pianist for a short, simple melody between performances, and she was available. That was all. No special introduction, no big announcement. Just a request to play something soft in the background so the program could continue smoothly. Still, she accepted the invitation without hesitation. Not because she felt confident, but because she loved the piano more than anything else. Even if she was not the best in the room, she still wanted to sit in front of the instrument and let her hands speak for her. That thought had always given her courage. But now, standing just outside the hall, her courage felt smaller. She took a slow breath and stepped inside. The lighting inside was warm and slightly golden, making everything feel calm and formal at the same time. Rows of chairs were filled with guests. Some were dressed elegantly, while others looked relaxed but attentive. At the front of the hall stood a polished piano, its black surface shining under the soft lights. It was already waiting for the next performer. She quietly moved to a seat near the side, trying not to draw attention. As she sat down, she noticed how confident some of the other performers looked. They were speaking easily with one another, laughing, adjusting their outfits, and discussing pieces they had performed before. They seemed like they belonged here naturally. She, however, felt like someone watching from the outside. While she sat there, waiting, she could hear fragments of conversations around her. Some were discussing technical details of music, others were talking about famous pianists and difficult compositions. She listened quietly, trying not to let her thoughts drift too far. But deep inside, a small voice started to grow. It asked whether she really belonged in a place like this. Her hands tightened slightly around the folder in her lap. She thought about her journey with the piano. It had not been easy or smooth. She had started with simple lessons, learning one note at a time. There were days when she practiced for hours, repeating the same piece again and again until her fingers ached. There were also days when she felt frustrated, when nothing sounded right, and when she wondered if she should stop altogether. But she never stopped. The piano had become something more than just an instrument for her. It was a way to express things she could not say in words. When she played alone, she did not feel judged. She did not feel compared to others. It was just her and the music. Still, this room was different. Here she was not alone. Here every mistake could be noticed. Every hesitation could be judged. A small announcement was made from the front of the hall. The program was beginning. The first performance started, and the audience slowly turned their attention forward. She listened carefully, watching the stage from where she sat. The first act went smoothly. It was simple and well received, followed by polite applause. Then came another performance. Again, the audience responded positively. Everything was going according to plan, calm and controlled. As each performance passed, her turn slowly came closer. She felt it even before her name was mentioned. That strange pressure in the air, the quiet expectation that builds before someone steps onto the stage. She looked down at her hands again. They were still slightly nervous, but now there was something else too. Something she could not fully describe. A mix of fear and focus. A part of her wanted to disappear into the crowd and avoid the moment completely. But another part reminded her why she was here in the first place. She had not come to prove anything to anyone. She had come because she had been asked to play a simple melody, and she had agreed. That should have been easy enough. Still, deep inside, she knew something important about herself. Even when given something simple, she never played it in a simple way. Whenever she touched the piano, something inside her naturally transformed the music. She could not always explain it, but she felt every note deeply. She listened not just with her ears, but with her emotions. A soft movement at the front of the hall caught her attention. Someone was preparing to announce the next performer. She straightened her posture slightly without thinking. Her heartbeat became more noticeable, not fast, but steady and heavy. She reminded herself again that it was just a simple melody. Nothing difficult, nothing complex, just something short to fill the space between performances. Still, she could not ignore the feeling growing inside her. This was the moment she had quietly been moving toward since she entered the hall. And soon, she would have to walk forward and sit in front of the piano. The hall continued to move forward with its program. But for her, time felt slower than usual. Every performance that passed seemed to stretch longer than it should have. She stayed in her seat, trying to look calm, but her attention kept drifting toward the piano at the front of the room. It stood there quietly, as if it was waiting for the next person who would sit in front of it and bring it to life. She adjusted her grip on the folder in her hands again. The sheets inside were already slightly creased from how tightly she had been holding them. She told herself to relax, but her body was not fully listening. It was not fear of the piano itself. It was the feeling of being watched, even before she had done anything. Around her, the audience remained engaged in polite attention. Soft clapping followed each performance. Some people nodded in appreciation. Others whispered quietly to each other about what they had just heard. The atmosphere was respectful, but also quietly competitive in a way she could sense even without hearing everything clearly. She looked down for a moment, focusing on her breathing. In and out, slow and steady. She had learned this trick a long time ago when nerves used to take over completely. It helped a little, but not enough to remove the thoughts forming in her mind. She started thinking about how easily others seemed to belong in this space. The performers who had already played walked back to their seats with confidence, as if they had done nothing unusual. Some smiled at friends, some received quiet praise. They looked comfortable in a way she did not feel. She wondered if she had made a mistake by accepting the invitation. It was not that she wanted to refuse the chance. In fact, she had been grateful when she was asked. But now, sitting there in the middle of so many experienced people, she felt the difference between being invited and truly being expected. Her thoughts drifted back to her earlier practice sessions. She remembered the small room where she usually practiced. It was not perfect. The lighting was simple and the furniture was old. But that room had always felt safe. There was no pressure there. No audience. No silent judgment. Just her and the piano. In that space, she could play freely. Sometimes she would repeat the same melody for hours, changing small details, experimenting with rhythm, or simply letting her emotions guide her fingers. Those moments felt real, honest, uncomplicated. But here, everything felt different. She glanced around the hall again. People were still focused on the stage. Some leaned forward slightly, paying attention. Others sat back comfortably. She noticed how easily they seemed to separate themselves from the performers, as if observing from a distance. A soft applause broke her thoughts. Another performance had ended. The program was moving forward. She felt a small tightening in her chest. She knew it was getting closer. Her name had not been called yet, but she could feel the transition approaching. The space between performances was becoming shorter. The stage was being prepared for the next act. Someone adjusted the microphone. Another person quietly arranged the music stand near the piano, even though she would not need it for a simple melody. She lowered her eyes again, trying to calm her thoughts. But then, as often happens in quiet moments, small sounds around her became more noticeable. She caught fragments of conversation from nearby seats, not directed at her, but still reaching her ears. A few people were discussing the simplicity of the upcoming piano piece. They expected something light, something short, something that would not demand too much attention. It was not said in a harsh way, just casual conversation. Still, the words settled in her mind in a way she did not expect. Simple. Short. Background music. She looked down at her hands again. Were they really seeing her performance as just background music? She tried to push the thought away, but it stayed. Another quiet voice in a different direction mentioned how some performers were only invited to fill the program. It was not loud, not intended to hurt anyone, but it still reached her. She immediately told herself not to take it personally. People often spoke without thinking about who might be listening. Still, something inside her shifted slightly. It was not anger. It was something softer. A quiet feeling of being underestimated. She had experienced this before in smaller ways. People often assume things based on appearance or first impression. She was not the most outgoing person in the room. She did not speak loudly or try to draw attention. Because of that, many assumed she was also not strong in her skill. But they did not know how many hours she had spent alone practicing. They did not know how many times she had restarted a piece because it did not sound honest enough. They did not know how often she stayed behind after everyone else stopped practicing, just to make sure she understood every note properly. She did not do it to prove anything to others. She did it because she cared deeply about the music. A soft announcement came from the front again. The next performer would be called soon. Her body reacted before her mind fully processed it. Her posture straightened slightly. Her fingers relaxed, then tightened again. She could feel her heartbeat becoming more noticeable now, steady but strong. She looked toward the stage area. The piano was still there, calm, waiting. She imagined what it would feel like to sit there, to place her hands on the keys, to hear the first note fill the room. She had done it many times before in practice, but never in front of a crowd like this. She tried to picture the simple melody she was supposed to play. It was not difficult. She knew it well. She could play it without thinking too much. It was almost automatic for her at this point. But something inside her made her hesitate. It was not doubt about the piece. It was something deeper. A quiet feeling that if she touched the piano in front of this audience, it would not stay simple for long. That thought surprised her a little, because she did not consciously plan to change anything. But experience had taught her something she could not ignore. When she played, she felt everything more deeply than she intended. Even the simplest notes sometimes carried emotion she could not hold back. She exhaled slowly. The program continued. Another small performance was announced. Applause followed again. Everything was moving in order as planned. But she was no longer fully listening. Her focus had shifted inward. She thought about why she had started playing piano in the first place. It was never about attention or praise. It was something personal. Something she discovered by accident when she first touched the keys and realized how sound could express emotion without words. Over time, it became a part of her identity. Not something she showed off, but something she carried quietly. Now, sitting in this hall, she felt that part of her becoming heavier, as if it was preparing for something important. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement at the front. Someone was stepping toward the microphone. She knew what was coming next. Her name. She did not hear it immediately in her mind, but she felt it in the way the room shifted slightly. Heads turned. Attention gathered. The quiet expectation reached its peak. She closed her fingers around the folder one last time, then slowly released it. It was time. The moment her name was finally called, the entire atmosphere in the hall seemed to shift in a way she could feel rather than hear. It was not loud or dramatic, but there was a quiet change in attention. Conversations faded. Movements slowed. Even the soft background sounds of the room felt like they were gently pulled back. She sat still for a second, almost as if her body needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Then she slowly stood up. Every step she took toward the front felt longer than it actually was. The space between her seat and the piano did not look far, but in her mind, it felt like a path where every eye in the room was quietly following her. She tried to keep her expression calm, but inside, her thoughts were moving quickly. She reminded herself again that it was only a simple melody, just a short performance. Nothing complicated, nothing to fear. That thought should have been enough to calm her, but her heart still beat a little stronger than usual. As she walked, she could feel the presence of the audience more clearly. It was not hostility or pressure in a direct way. It was something quieter. Expectation. Curiosity. Some people were watching with polite interest, while others were simply waiting for the program to continue. A few were still adjusting their posture as she approached the stage area. The piano was now fully in front of her. It looked more impressive up close than it had from her seat. Its surface reflected the soft lighting of the hall. The bench was already placed in position, as if it had been prepared carefully for her arrival. Someone had clearly arranged everything to make sure the moment would go smoothly. She stopped for a brief second just before sitting down. That small pause felt heavier than she expected. It was not fear of the piano itself. She had sat in front of many instruments before. It was the feeling of stepping into a space where she knew she would be noticed, even if only for a few minutes. The room behind her felt like it was holding its breath. Then she sat down. The bench felt slightly cooler than she expected, but comfortable. She adjusted her position gently, making sure she was balanced and steady. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment before slowly moving toward the keys. The piano keys were right in front of her now. Black and white. Simple. Familiar. Yet somehow, in this moment, they felt more serious than ever. She took a slow breath in. Then another one out. She reminded herself again that she had done this many times before in private. Sitting in front of a piano was not new. Playing was not new. But doing it in front of this many eyes was different. Still, she did not allow herself to move away from the moment. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys. The hall was completely quiet now. Even the smallest sound in the room seemed to carry more weight than usual. Somewhere far in the back, a chair shifted slightly, then became still again. That was the only movement she noticed. She waited. This was the moment just before sound begins. A strange kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. She had always noticed it during performances, but now she felt it more deeply than ever before. Her mind briefly thought about the melody she was supposed to play. It was simple. A few soft notes arranged in a gentle pattern. She could almost play it without looking at the keys. Her practice had made it familiar enough that her fingers knew where to go. But still, she did not start immediately. Something inside her was unusually aware. It was as if the room, the piano, and even her own thoughts were waiting together. She glanced down at the keys again, then slowly straightened her shoulders. This was supposed to be just another performance. A short moment in a long program. Something that would pass quietly and be forgotten by most people in the room. That was what it was meant to be. She gently pressed her fingers down. The first note came out soft and clear. It filled the room in a way that made everything else feel even quieter. She continued. The second note followed. Then the third. The melody began to form slowly, carefully, like something being built piece by piece. Her fingers moved with control, not rushing, not hesitating. Each note was placed exactly as she had practiced it. At first, it was exactly what the audience expected. Simple, calm, pleasant. Some people in the room relaxed slightly. A few leaned back in their seats. It was the kind of music that could easily blend into the background of an evening program. But something was changing inside her. It was not a decision she made. It was not something planned. It was more like a natural flow that started to grow as she played. Her fingers began to move with slightly more expression. A small pause between notes became slightly longer. A gentle shift in rhythm appeared without her forcing it. The melody, still the same at its core, started to carry more feeling than before. She could sense it even as she played. The music was no longer just a repetition of practice. It was becoming something more personal. In the audience, a few people started to notice the change, though they could not clearly explain it. The piece still sounded familiar, but it no longer felt completely ordinary. She kept her eyes on the keys, but her focus was no longer just on accuracy. It was on feeling. Her fingers moved more naturally now, as if they were responding to something deeper than written notes. The sound became warmer, slightly more expressive, still controlled, but no longer flat. The simple melody was slowly beginning to carry emotion. She did not realize when it started, but she had stopped thinking about the audience. For a brief moment it was just her and the piano again. That feeling was familiar, safe, honest. She let herself stay in it. The notes became more fluid. A soft variation entered the rhythm, almost like a quiet conversation within the music itself. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make the melody feel more alive. In the hall, attention slowly began to shift. Some people who were previously relaxed now started to look forward again. Others tilted their heads slightly, trying to understand what was happening. The music was still simple, but it was no longer something easily ignored. Her hands moved with growing confidence. She was no longer just playing what was written. She was expressing it. Each note seemed to carry a small emotion with it. Not loud or overwhelming, but present enough to be felt. The melody that was supposed to remain simple was quietly turning into something deeper. She was still aware of the room, but it no longer controlled her focus. Her connection to the piano had taken over. The bench, the stage, the audience, all of it felt slightly distant now. What remained clear was the sound, flowing through her hands and into the air. She continued playing, unaware that the performance she was meant to keep simple was slowly starting to become something no one in the room had expected. Her fingers continued to move across the piano keys, but now something had changed in the air around her. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like a small shift in temperature that only a few people might sense. The melody was still simple in structure, still based on the piece she had been asked to play, but the feeling behind it was no longer the same. In the beginning, she had followed the notes exactly as they were written. Careful, controlled, safe. But now each note seemed to carry a slightly different weight. Some were softer, stretched gently as if they were breathing. Others were pressed a little deeper, giving the sound more depth than before. She did not consciously decide to change anything. It was happening naturally, as if the piano itself was guiding her through a familiar path, but showing her new corners she had never noticed before. Her focus had become quiet and deep. The room, the people, the expectations, all of it faded slightly into the background. What remained in her mind was the sound she was creating and the feeling behind each movement of her hands. She was still aware that people were watching, but it no longer made her nervous in the same way. Something about the music had given her a kind of silent confidence. In the audience, the atmosphere was beginning to shift in ways that were not immediately obvious. Some people were still sitting comfortably, expecting a short and simple performance. But a few had started to notice something different. They could not clearly explain it, but the music no longer felt like background sound. It was starting to feel like something worth paying attention to. A man in the middle row, who had been casually leaning back in his seat, slowly straightened his posture. A woman near the side stopped, whispering to the person next to her. Even those who were distracted began to look forward again without realizing why. The melody was still familiar, but it was slowly gaining emotion. She reached a small pause in the music, a moment where the notes could have continued in a predictable way. But instead, she allowed a slight delay, holding the silence just a little longer than expected. It was not planned. It was felt. Then she continued, and something deeper emerged. The second part of the melody carried a warmer tone. The rhythm was still steady, but there was more expression in the way she shaped each note. It was as if she was no longer simply playing music, but telling a quiet story through sound. Her hands moved with growing ease. The tension she had felt earlier was no longer in control of her movements. Instead, there was a natural flow, like her fingers understood something her thoughts were only beginning to realize. The simple melody she had been asked to play was slowly transforming. Not into something completely different, but into something richer, more emotional, more alive. She did not look up at the audience. Her eyes remained on the piano keys, but her awareness of the room was still there, like a distant echo. She could sense the change in attention. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was real. The room was listening more closely now. Each note she played seemed to hold a little more weight than before. The sound filled the hall in a way that made even the smallest details noticeable. The soft echoes between notes, the gentle pauses, the rise and fall of rhythm. It all started to feel intentional, even though she was not forcing it. Inside her, something had shifted too. She remembered why she loved the piano in the first place. It was not about perfection or applause. It was about expression, about taking something simple and giving it life through emotion. That feeling had been buried under pressure for a while, but now it was returning. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Her breathing became steady. Her fingers no longer felt like they were being controlled by nerves. Instead, they were moving in harmony with the sound she was creating. The melody grew slightly stronger, still simple at its core, but now layered with feeling. A soft rise in tone came as she moved into the next section. The notes were no longer just following a pattern. They were beginning to shape a mood, a quiet emotional arc that the audience could sense even if they could not name it. Some in the audience exchanged brief glances, unsure of what exactly was happening. They had expected something short and forgettable, but what they were hearing now was holding their attention in a different way. It was not loud or dramatic. It was sincere, and that sincerity made it powerful. She continued playing, unaware of how deeply the room was beginning to respond. Her mind was no longer focused on performance in the traditional sense. She was not thinking about impressing anyone. She was not thinking about mistakes. She was fully inside the music now, allowing it to guide her instead of controlling it. The melody shifted again. A slightly more expressive passage emerged, still based on the original piece, but shaped with subtle variations that gave it emotional depth. The timing between notes stretched just enough to create feeling without breaking the flow. It was in these small changes that something extraordinary was forming. In the audience, silence became more complete. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that comes from attention. People were now fully listening. Some leaned forward slightly. Others had their eyes fixed on her hands, trying to understand how a simple melody had become something that felt so different in such a short time. She continued without hesitation. Her confidence was no longer forced. It was natural now, built from connection rather than pressure. Each note she played felt like part of a conversation between her and the piano. The music was no longer just something she performed. It was something she experienced. A soft emotional peak began to form in the melody. Not sudden or loud, but gradual. Like a wave slowly building before it reaches the shore. The sound carried more depth now, more feeling, more presence. Even those who did not understand music deeply could feel it. Something had changed. Something real was happening in front of them. Her fingers moved slightly faster for a brief moment, then softened again, creating contrast in the rhythm. It was not planned technique. It was instinct, a natural response to the emotion building inside the piece. The simple melody she had been asked to play was no longer simple. It had become something far beyond what anyone expected when she first sat down. And still, she did not stop. She continued playing, unaware that the room behind her had already begun to change in silence. The music was no longer just something she was playing. It had become something that was unfolding in real time, shaped by her emotions, her memory, and the quiet connection she felt with the piano. The simple melody that had once been assigned to her was now growing into something far more expressive than anyone in the room had expected. Her fingers moved with steady control, but there was a new depth in the way she pressed each key. Some notes lingered slightly longer than written, while others flowed into the next with a soft connection that made the sound feel continuous and alive. It was not random. It was not chaotic. It was controlled in a way that only came from someone deeply connected to what they were playing. The audience could feel it now. At first, it had been subtle. A few people noticing a change, a slight shift in tone. But now, it was no longer something only a few could sense. The entire room had started to respond. The quiet conversations had completely stopped. People who were previously relaxed or distracted were now fully focused on the stage. Even those who had been casually waiting for the next part of the program were now watching closely, as if something unexpected had entered the room without warning. She, however, remained unaware of the full impact. Her attention was inside the music. As she moved into the next section of the melody, something deeper began to rise within her. It was not planned or rehearsed. It came from somewhere inside her that she did not always understand. A feeling, a memory, a quiet emotion that seemed to guide her hands without asking permission. The music became richer, not louder but fuller. Each note seemed to carry a story now. A soft beginning, a gentle rise, and a quiet fall that left space for emotion to breathe. The piano was no longer just producing sound. It felt like it was speaking in a language that did not need words. In the audience, the transformation was becoming impossible to ignore. A man who had been sitting with folded arms slowly lowered them. A woman near the front tilted her head slightly, as if trying to catch every detail of the sound. A few people leaned forward without realizing it, drawn in by something they could not fully explain. It was still the same melody and structure, but it no longer felt the same in experience. That was what made it powerful. The simplicity of it remained, but it had been filled with emotion in a way that gave it depth. She moved into a slightly more intense passage. Her fingers pressed a little firmer now, not in force, but in expression. The sound responded immediately, becoming more present, more emotional, more alive. There was a moment where the rhythm slowed slightly, almost like a breath being taken within the music itself. That pause was not silence. It was anticipation. It was space for feeling to settle before the next wave of sound arrived. Then she continued, and the music expanded again. It was as if the melody was no longer confined to its original form. It was growing outward, shaped by her emotions in real time. She was not changing the foundation, but she was coloring it with depth that made it feel new. The audience felt it more strongly now. Some people were visibly still. Others had their hands resting quietly in their laps, completely focused. There was no movement of distraction anymore. The entire room had become centered on her and the piano. Even the air in the hall seemed different, heavier in attention, calmer in energy. She reached a section of the melody where the emotion naturally rose. It was a point in the piece that, in its original form, was meant to be simple and soft. But now, she allowed it to grow slightly more expressive. Not exaggerated, just honest. Her fingers moved with a fluid motion that made the transition between notes feel seamless. The sound that followed was gentle but powerful in feeling. It carried something that could not be easily described. A sense of reflection, of something remembered, of something felt deeply but quietly. In that moment, something changed in the audience's perception. They were no longer listening to a simple performance. They were experiencing something personal. Even though they did not know her story, they could feel emotion behind the music. It was not just technical skill. It was something human, something real. Her posture remained steady at the piano, but inside, she was fully immersed. She was no longer thinking about how the audience might react. She was no longer aware of expectations. She was simply allowing the music to flow through her without resistance. That was when the melody reached its most expressive point so far. A soft rise in intensity came through her hands. The notes became slightly more layered, not in complexity, but in feeling. It was as if she was telling a story that did not need explanation. The sound filled the hall completely. There was a kind of silence in the audience that was not empty, but full of attention, full of emotion, full of something unspoken that connected everyone in the room. A few people blinked slowly, as if realizing they had been holding their breath without noticing. Others simply remained still, fully absorbed in what they were hearing. She continued without pause. The melody now felt like it had taken on a life of its own. It moved forward with purpose, rising and falling in a natural emotional rhythm that felt both controlled and free at the same time. Her hands followed it effortlessly, as if they were no longer separate from the music itself. The piano responded to her touch with warmth. Each key press added another layer to the growing emotion in the room. And still, she did not see the full effect she was creating. To her, it was still about expression, about feeling, about letting something inside her find a voice through sound. But to the audience, it was becoming something unforgettable. The simple melody had transformed into something far beyond its original intention. Not because it had been changed into something complex, but because it had been filled with sincerity and emotion that reached everyone listening. The room was completely silent now except for the piano. And that silence was not empty. It was filled with attention, filled with emotion, filled with the beginning of something no one in the room had expected when the program first started. The final part of the performance did not feel like an ending at first. It felt like the music was still continuing somewhere in the air, even when her fingers briefly slowed between notes. The hall was completely silent except for the piano, and that silence was no longer empty. It was full of attention, full of emotion, and full of something that no one in the room could easily explain. She was still fully focused on the keys in front of her, unaware of how deeply the audience had been drawn into the moment. For her, it was still about feeling the music, letting it flow naturally without forcing anything. The melody had grown far beyond what she had been asked to play, but she was not thinking about that anymore. She was simply inside it now. Her hands moved with calm control as she entered the final part of the piece. The energy in the music began to soften slightly, like a long breath being slowly released. The intensity that had built earlier was still present, but it was now being shaped into something gentler, more reflective. Each note carried a quiet sense of closure. Not an ending that felt sudden or sharp, but one that felt natural, like a story slowly coming to rest after being told with honesty. In the audience, people were still completely still. No one was speaking. No one was moving unnecessarily. Even those who had not expected to be so deeply affected were now fully absorbed in what they were hearing. Some had their eyes fixed on her hands, watching every small movement. Others simply looked forward, as if lost in thought. A few people had slightly lowered their heads, not in distraction, but in quiet reflection. It was the kind of silence that only appears when something meaningful is being experienced. She continued playing, unaware of the full impact. The melody began to return gently toward its original form. The same simple structure she had started with was still there, but now it carried a completely different feeling. What had once been just a basic tune had transformed into something layered with emotion and depth. It was no longer just notes. It was expression. It was memory. It was feeling. Her fingers moved with soft precision as she guided the music toward its final phrases. The rhythm slowed slightly, allowing each note to breathe before moving to the next. There was no rush, no pressure, only flow. In that moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath with her.